The mountain training ground fell silent the moment the soldier poured water over the monk's head. The old man was calm, dressed in saffron robes, and didn't move, not even to wipe his face. That's all Sergeant Stephen Tuttle needed to see before he smirked. "Looks like your God's got a sense of humor, old man," he said, his voice carrying across the formation. The soldiers behind him laughed nervously. The monk didn't. He simply pressed his palms together, eyes closed, water dripping down his bald head. Then, with one whispered phrase, everything changed. "Water cleanses all things," the old man said. "Even arrogance." The laughter stopped. No one knew it yet, but the man they were mocking wasn't just another temple gardener. He was a retired Shaolin master, with skills that could disarm a man before he even knew he was in danger. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next made every soldier on that base question what real strength looks like. Before we get started, don't forget to give this video a like, hit that subscribe button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your support helps us bring you even more incredible stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into the story. The wind howled through the Himalayan peaks, with a sound that could break a man's resolve before he ever faced combat. It was a sound that separated the strong from the simply confident, the disciplined from the merely trained. But when 69-year-old Brother Xavier Cross first arrived at the mountain monastery 12 years ago, his expression hadn't changed. His weathered hands remained steady on his walking staff, his shoulders straight, despite the thin orange robe that hung loose on his lean, muscular frame. The commanding officer of the nearby military base barely looked at the monks when they first arrived with supplies. Another group of religious men living in isolation, probably seeking peace or running from something. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening, just quiet figures who kept to themselves and occasionally brought water and provisions to the soldiers stationed along the border. But if that commanding officer had looked closer, really looked, he might have noticed something different about Xavier Cross. The way he moved with purpose, even with a bamboo staff in hand. The way his eyes took in every detail of the training grounds without seeming to stare. The way his breathing remained controlled and measured even at high altitude, where most men gasped for air. The way his forearms, visible beneath rolled sleeves, bore the faint scars of a life lived in combat, not contemplation. Xavier had been a warrior for 40 years before he became a monk. He had trained under Master Liang in the Shaolin Temple of Henan Province, mastered 18 weapons and 32 hand-to-hand forms, and fought off armed bandits during the border conflicts of the 1980s. He had lived a fierce, disciplined life built on precision, honor, and the ancient teachings passed down through blood and sweat. Then one day, he hurt a man so badly that he swore never to raise his hand in anger again. Now he was Brother Xavier Cross, gardener and spiritual guide to a community of monks perched on the edge of the world. And the next chapter of his life would test whether mercy was stronger than mastery. The military camp Xavier's monastery neighbored was controlled by one man, and everyone knew it. Sergeant Stephen Tuttle was 35 years old and built like a walking arsenal, 6 feet 2 inches of raw muscle, buzz-cut hair, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains around him. His barrel chest was covered in tattoos that told the story of a decade in combat zones. His crew of loyal soldiers moved through the base like extensions of his will, and in many ways, they were. Stephen had built his reputation on dominance and results. He decided who earned respect and who got humiliated during drills. He determined which recruits made it through mountain survival training and which ones got sent back to desk jobs. The officers looked the other way because Stephen kept discipline in his own brutal fashion, and that made their command easier. When word spread that monks from the nearby temple would be coming through the base regularly to deliver supplies, Stephen's interest was immediately piqued. Fresh targets meant fresh opportunities to remind everyone exactly who ran things on this mountain. The first time Stephen laid eyes on Xavier, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. An old black man, probably older than his own father would have been if the old drunk hadn't died in a bar fight. Shaved head, weathered hands, moving with deliberate care, like every step was part of some religious ritual. This wasn't just easy prey. This was an insult to everything Stephen believed about strength. Xavier's first week at the base was quiet. He delivered water with the other monks, tended to the small herb garden they'd planted near the mess hall, and sat in meditation each morning just outside the monastery gates. He didn't speak to the soldiers unless spoken to. He didn't interrupt drills or training. He simply existed, calm, present, and unnervingly at peace. One evening, a young private named Marcus Chen, who'd been struggling with anxiety since his deployment, found himself sitting near Xavier during sunset meditation. "How do you stay so calm?" Marcus whispered after a long silence. "Everything here is loud. The drills, the officers, even the wind. But you're just still." Xavier opened his eyes slowly and turned to the young man. "Fear and anger cloud judgment," he said softly, his voice barely rising above the mountain breeze. "Clarity comes from stillness." Marcus didn't fully understand what that meant, but something in the old monk's voice made him feel safer than he had in months. He nodded and sat quietly beside Xavier until the sun disappeared behind the peaks. Stephen watched this exchange from a distance, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't like the way the monk made people feel comfortable. He didn't like the respect that came without force. And most of all, he didn't like that Xavier never seemed to notice him, or worse, noticed him and didn't care. The next morning brought the confrontation that would change everything. Stephen had positioned himself and his unit near the monastery steps, making sure every monk would have to walk past them during their morning water delivery. It was a power move, a reminder of the hierarchy that existed in this place. Xavier entered the training ground carrying a wooden bucket, moving with the same quiet dignity he had maintained since his arrival. He walked to refill the water stations, his eyes scanning the area not with fear, but with the practiced awareness of someone who had spent decades reading the intentions of others. The mountain air was crisp and cold, but Stephen stood shirtless, his chest glistening with sweat from the early morning drills. He took what the moment offered without hesitation and began walking directly toward the kneeling monk. That's when Stephen made his move. "Well, well, well," Stephen's voice boomed across the training ground, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn. "Look what we got here, boys. Monk's got himself confused. Thinks he's a temple instead of a military base." Xavier continued his prayer, his hands steady as he knelt on the stone steps, his expression unchanged. He had dealt with bullies before, though not in quite this setting. The principle remained the same: show no fear, but avoid unnecessary confrontation. Stephen stepped directly into Xavier's path, his massive frame blocking the morning sun. His shadow fell across the monk like a threat made physical. He unscrewed his canteen slowly, deliberately, making sure every soldier was watching. Then he tipped it forward and poured cold mountain water over Xavier's bowed head. The water ran down the monk's face, soaking his robes, pooling on the stone beneath him. The soldiers behind Stephen chuckled nervously, then fell completely silent when Xavier didn't react. He simply pressed his palms together more firmly, eyes still closed, as if the water was part of the meditation itself. "You missed a spot, old man," Stephen mocked, his voice dripping with contempt. Xavier finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying across the entire courtyard. "Water cleanses all things, even arrogance." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Stephen's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. Something in the monk's tone felt less like submission and more like a warning. But Stephen shook it off, laughed, and walked away, his soldiers following behind like wolves trailing their alpha. None of them noticed the way Xavier's eyes opened slowly after they left. None of them saw the faint, knowing smile that crossed his lips. And none of them realized that the calm, quiet gardener they'd just humiliated was once known throughout Shaolin as the Silent Dragon, a master whose stillness hid a storm that could break a man's bones before he even saw the strike coming. But to understand what happened next, and why the coming days would shatter everything Stephen thought he knew about strength, we need to go back. Back to a time before orange robes and mountain monasteries. Back to when Xavier Cross was not a man of peace, but a warrior forged in fire, blood, and the ancient discipline of Shaolin. The mess hall that evening buzzed with a different kind of energy. Soldiers who normally talked about football scores and leave dates now huddled in tight circles, their voices low, their eyes occasionally darting toward the windows that faced the monastery in the distance. "I'm telling you, man, that monk didn't even flinch." Private Marcus Chen leaned forward, his tray of cold meatloaf forgotten. "The Sarge dumped half a canteen on him, and the old man just sat there like it was a baptism or something." "Maybe he's deaf," someone suggested. "Nah." Corporal Danny Reyes shook his head, his dark eyes serious. "I've seen him around the base before. He hears everything. Hell, I was cursing under my breath last week when I dropped a crate, and he turned around and smiled at me like he knew exactly what I said." "So what? He's just tough?" Another soldier laughed nervously. "He's gotta be what, 70? My grandpa's that age, and he can barely get out of his chair without help." "Your grandpa didn't move like this one does." Reyes lowered his voice even further, glancing around to make sure no senior NCOs were listening. "I've been here 6 months. I've seen that monk carry water buckets up those monastery steps without breaking a sweat. I've seen him working in the garden, and I swear to God, the way he uses that hoe, it's not farming. It's like, I don't know, like he's training with a weapon." "You're paranoid, bro." "Maybe." Reyes shrugged, but his expression remained uneasy. "But there's something about him. The way he looks at you, not through you, but like he sees everything you're thinking. And the way he moves, it's too smooth, too controlled. My Tio back in California used to box, and he moved like that. Like every step was on purpose." Marcus nodded slowly. "I sat with him during sunset yesterday. He said something about stillness and clarity. At first I thought it was just monk talk, you know? But when he said it, it felt real. Like he'd actually lived through some serious stuff and came out the other side. What kind of stuff? I don't know. But men don't get that calm unless they've been through hell and made peace with it." The conversation died abruptly as Sergeant Tuttle entered the mess hall. He didn't acknowledge anyone, didn't make his usual rounds of intimidation and jokes. He just grabbed a coffee, black and steaming, and sat alone at a corner table, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. The soldiers exchanged glances. Stephen Tuttle never sat alone. Stephen couldn't stop replaying it. The water hitting the monk's bald head, running down his face in rivulets, soaking into those ridiculous orange robes. The way the old man's expression hadn't changed. Not anger, not fear, not even annoyance. Just nothing. Just that same infuriating calm. And then those words. Water cleanses all things, even arrogance. What the hell was that supposed to mean? Was it a threat? A prophecy? Or just some religious mumbo-jumbo meant to sound deep? Stephen clenched his fists around his coffee mug, the ceramic warm against his calloused palms. He'd humiliated men twice that monk's size. He'd made grown soldiers cry during training exercises. He'd broken the will of recruits who thought they were tough until they met him. But that old man hadn't broken. Hadn't even bent. Why didn't he react? Why didn't he fight back? The questions gnawed at Stephen like wolves on a carcass. He drained his coffee in 3 long gulps and stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Every head in the mess hall turned toward him. "What are you looking at?" he barked. The soldiers immediately returned to their trays, their conversations resuming in hushed tones. Stephen stormed out into the cold mountain night, the wind biting at his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was elsewhere, on orange robes and steady eyes, and a silence that felt heavier than any insult. The next afternoon, Stephen found himself on patrol duty along the perimeter fence that separated the military base from the monastery grounds. It was a routine assignment, usually boring, but today he welcomed it. He needed to move, needed to think, needed to burn off whatever this feeling was that sat in his chest like a stone. That's when he saw him. Xavier Cross stood at the base of the monastery steps, a bamboo broom in his hands, sweeping fallen leaves and dust with slow, deliberate strokes. Back and forth, back and forth. The rhythm was hypnotic. Stephen stopped walking, his hand resting on the chain-link fence, and watched. At first, it seemed like nothing, just an old man doing chores. But the longer Stephen watched, the more unsettled he became. The way Xavier moved the broom wasn't random. Every stroke was identical in length and pressure. Every pivot of his body was perfectly balanced. His feet shifted in small, precise steps, his weight transferring smoothly from one leg to the other. It looked like a dance, or a drill. Stephen's breath caught. He'd seen movement like that before, in martial arts demonstrations, in hand-to-hand combat training videos, in the fluid motions of fighters who'd trained for decades until every action became instinct. But this was an old man, sweeping. There was no reason for it to look like that. Xavier paused, tilting his head slightly as if sensing he was being watched. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Stephen's across the distance. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Xavier smiled, faint, almost imperceptible, and returned to his sweeping. Stephen's jaw tightened. He forced himself to keep walking, but his heart was pounding harder than it should have been. Get it together, Tuttle. He's just a weird old monk. That's all. But deep down, in a place Stephen didn't want to acknowledge, a small voice whispered, "You don't know what you're dealing with." That evening, Corporal Reyes found himself alone in the supply room, organizing ammunition crates, when Xavier appeared in the doorway like a ghost. Reyes jumped, nearly dropping a box of rounds. "Jesus, Brother Xavier, you scared the hell out of me. My apologies." Xavier's voice was soft, warm, tinged with an accent that Reyes couldn't quite place, part American, part something else. "I did not mean to startle you. I came to retrieve the water filters we ordered last week." "Oh, right." Reyes set down the crate and wiped his hands on his pants. "Let me grab those for you."
As he rummaged through the shelves, Reyes couldn't help himself. "Brother Xavier, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Where are you from? I mean, originally?" Xavier leaned against the door frame, his hands folded in front of him. "I was born in Kingston, Jamaica. My family moved to New York when I was 6. I grew up in Brooklyn." "Brooklyn?" Reyes blinked in surprise. "How does a kid from Brooklyn end up in a monastery on a mountain in Asia?" Xavier's smile deepened, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "The path is rarely straight, young man. I was restless as a boy, angry. My father worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep us fed. I fought anyone who looked at me wrong. I thought strength meant never backing down." Reyes found the filters and handed them to Xavier, but he didn't leave. He wanted to hear more. "What changed?" Reyes asked. "A man named Master Liang." Xavier's eyes grew distant, as if looking back through decades. "I was 17, full of rage, and I picked a fight with the wrong person, a Chinese exchange student at my high school. I thought I'd teach him a lesson. Instead, he put me on the ground in 3 seconds, without even hurting me." "Damn." "Indeed," Xavier chuckled softly. "He told me if I wanted to learn real strength, I should come to his grandfather's school. So I did. And eventually, Master Liang took me to Shaolin. I spent 15 years there, learning not just how to fight, but why we fight. And more importantly, when we shouldn't." Reyes absorbed this, his mind racing. "So you're like a kung fu master?" "I was a student. I am still a student." Xavier's tone was humble but firm. "Mastery is not a destination. It is a practice. And when I left Shaolin, I left that life behind." "Why?" Xavier's expression darkened slightly. "Because I hurt someone, deadly. And I realized that all my training, all my discipline, it meant nothing if I couldn't control my own anger. So I became a Christian, devoted myself to God, and chose peace over power." "But you still remember how to fight." Xavier met Reyes's eyes, and for just a moment, the corporal saw something flicker there. Something ancient and dangerous, quickly buried beneath calm. "The body remembers what the mind tries to forget." Before Reyes could respond, Xavier bowed his head slightly in thanks, gathered the filters, and walked out into the fading light. Reyes stood there for a long moment, his heart beating faster than it should. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message into the group chat. "Just talk to the monk. You guys have no idea who he is." Stephen Tuttle stood in the latrine that night, alone under the harsh fluorescent lights, staring at his reflection in the metal mirror above the sink. His face looked harder than usual, the shadows under his eyes deeper. He turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on his face, the shock of it grounding him. But when he looked up again, all he could see was Xavier's face, calm, unbothered, soaked in the water Stephen had poured over him. That same faint smile, that same unshakable stillness. Why didn't he fight back? Stephen gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles going white. He'd spent his entire adult life proving he was the strongest man in any room. He'd earned his rank through blood, sweat, and sheer dominance. No one challenged him. No one dared. But this old man in orange robes had done something worse than challenge him. He'd dismissed him. Like Stephen was a child throwing a tantrum. Like he wasn't even worth a reaction. The door to the latrine swung open, and Private Chen walked in, stopping short when he saw Stephen. "Oh, sorry, Sarge. Didn't know you were—" "What do you want, Chen?"
Marcus hesitated, then stepped up to the sink beside Stephen, keeping his eyes down. "Nothing, Sarge, just wanted to wash up before lights out." Stephen watched him in the mirror, jaw tight. After a long pause, he spoke. "You talked to that monk." It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, he's a good listener." "You think he's weak?" Marcus looked up, surprised by the directness of the question. "No, Sarge, I don't." "Why not?" "He's old, he's small. He didn't fight back when I disrespected him." Marcus chose his words carefully. "My grandma used to say that the strongest trees are the ones that bend in the storm. The ones that stand rigid, they snap." Stephen's eyes narrowed. "You calling me rigid, Private?" "No, Sarge." Marcus turned off the water and grabbed a towel, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm just saying, maybe strength looks different than we think." He left before Stephen could respond. The door swung shut, leaving Stephen alone again with his reflection and the sound of dripping water. Outside, in the darkness beyond the barracks, 2 soldiers stood smoking cigarettes, their voices low. "Tuttle's been weird since this morning," one of them muttered. "Yeah, quiet. That's not like him." "You think the old monk got in his head?" The other soldier took a long drag, exhaling smoke into the cold night air. "Maybe the old man scared him." Inside the latrine, Stephen heard nothing, but as he stared at his own face in the mirror, hard, scarred, built by years of violence and dominance, a slow grin spread across his features. It wasn't a happy grin. It was the grin of a predator who'd just decided to stop circling and go for the kill. "He'll wish he had," Stephen whispered to his reflection. Then he turned off the light and walked out into the darkness, his mind already planning the next encounter. Because one thing was certain, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The old man in orange had made him look weak in front of his unit. And Sergeant Stephen Tuttle didn't do weak. He did dominance. He did control. He did victory. And he would make sure that Monk learned the difference between peace and surrender, even if he had to break the old man to teach him. The morning sun cut through the mountain mist like a blade, illuminating the training yard where 24 soldiers grappled in pairs, their grunts and shouts echoing off the monastery walls. Stephen Tuttle circled the perimeter like a prowling tiger, barking corrections and insults in equal measure. "Chen, if you telegraph your moves any harder, you might as well send a text message." Reyes, "Tighter guard! You're leaving your ribs wide open." The soldiers adjusted, muscles straining, sweat already darkening their shirts despite the cold air. Stephen thrived in moments like these. Total control, total dominance. His word, the only law that mattered. That's when he saw the orange robe. Xavier Cross emerged from the monastery path, a woven basket filled with fresh herbs balanced in his weathered hands. He moved with that same unhurried grace, his bare feet silent on the stone path, heading toward the small garden plot near the mess hall. Stephen's jaw tightened. The memory of water dripping down that bald head, of that infuriating calm, flooded back. In front of his men, the monk had made him feel small. Not today. "Hold!" Stephen's voice cracked across the yard. The soldiers froze mid-grapple, chests heaving. "We got ourselves a visitor, boys. Maybe the good monk here can bless us before we break some bones." Nervous laughter rippled through the formation. Xavier paused at the edge of the training area, his eyes meeting Stephen's across the dusty ground. He didn't smile this time. He simply stood, waiting. "Come on, old man." Stephen spread his arms wide, his voice dripping with mock hospitality. "Share some of that holy wisdom with us warriors." Xavier set down his basket carefully. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but clear enough to carry. Violence taught without wisdom creates monsters. The laughter died instantly. Stephen's smile hardened into something sharp and dangerous. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Then teach me wisdom, monk." Before Xavier could respond, Stephen lunged, not with full force, but enough to make his point, to remind everyone who owned this mountain. His hand shot out to grab the monk's collar, to shove him aside like the insignificant obstacle he was supposed to be. He never made contact. One moment, Stephen was moving forward, the next, he was airborne. The world flipped. His shoulder screamed as his arm twisted behind his back, pain exploding up through his neck. Then dirt, the taste of it in his mouth, the smell of it in his nose, his cheek pressed against the cold earth. No one had seen the monk move. No one had seen the pivot, the redirection, the subtle shift of weight that turned Stephen's aggression into his own downfall. It happened faster than thought, smoother than water. Xavier's voice was soft near his ear, almost gentle. "Anger blinds the warriors. Clear your heart before your next battle." The pressure on Stephen's arm released. Xavier stepped back, retrieved his basket, and continued toward the garden as if nothing had happened. Stephen pushed himself up slowly, dirt clinging to his face and bare chest. The entire formation stood frozen, eyes wide, mouths hanging open. For 3 terrible seconds, the only sound was the wind whistling through the peaks. Then Stephen laughed, loud, forced, desperate. "Not bad for an old man. Guess those yoga moves have some kick to them." He slapped his thigh, his grin too wide, too bright. "All right, back to work. Show's over." The soldiers returned to their drills, but their movements were mechanical now, distracted. They kept glancing at each other, at Stephen, at the monk disappearing behind the mess hall. That night, the barracks hummed with whispered conversations that cut off the moment Stephen entered a room. In the mess hall, soldiers leaned close over their trays, voices hushed, but electric. "Did you see that?" "I didn't see anything." "That's the point. The Sarge was down before I could blink. The old monk dropped him like he was nothing." "Keep your voice down, man." Stephen sat alone again, his untouched tray growing cold in front of him. His shoulder still ached, not badly, but enough to remind him, enough to make him replay those 2 seconds over and over, trying to understand what his body had felt, but his eyes hadn't seen. His jaw worked constantly, grinding teeth against teeth. In his chest, something dark and hot was taking root. Not just anger now, something worse. Obsession. Stephen found Corporal Reyes in the communications tent 2 days later, his voice low and urgent. "You said you've been here 6 months. You talked to the locals. I need you to find out about that monk." Reyes looked up from his laptop, eyebrows raised. "Brother Xavier?" "Yeah. Where he came from? What his deal is?" Stephen's jaw tightened. "Everything." It took Reyes 3 days and conversations with 2 village elders, a supply driver, and the monastery's younger monks before he found Stephen again. The sergeant was in the gym, alone, pounding a heavy bag with wrapped fists at 0200 hours. Sweat poured down his bare back, his knuckles already split and bleeding through the tape. "Sarge!" Reyes stood in the doorway, a folded piece of paper in his hand. "I found something." Stephen stopped mid-punch, his chest heaving. "Talk." Reyes glanced around to make sure they were alone, then stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Brother Xavier Cross,
Born Kingston, Jamaica, 1956. Moved to New York as a kid. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1975, he went to China. Enrolled at the Shaolin Temple in Henan Province under a master named Liang Zhen. Stephen grabbed a towel, wiping his face, but never taking his eyes off Reyes. Go on. He wasn't just some tourist learning kung fu, Sarge. He spent 15 years there. The locals, the ones old enough to remember, they called him something in Mandarin, Mo Yin Long. Reyes unfolded the paper, showing Chinese characters he'd written down. It means the silent dragon. Stephen's breath caught. Dragon. There's more. Reyes's voice grew quieter still. In the late 80s and early 90s, he fought in the border conflicts. Myanmar, Yunnan province, bandit raids, warlord skirmishes. The old supply driver said Xavier once defended an entire village from armed men, alone, with his hands and a bamboo staff. Then why is he here? Why the monk routine? Reyes met Stephen's eyes, and something like fear flickered there. They say he left the order after injuring a man so badly during a demonstration that the guy never walked right again. Xavier took a vow, converted to Christianity, swore never to raise his hand in anger again. Stephen stared at the paper in Reyes's hand, at the characters he couldn't read but could feel the weight of. The silent dragon, a legend hiding in orange robes. A warrior who'd chosen peace, not because he was weak, but because he knew exactly how dangerous he was. The revelation should have brought clarity. Instead, it ignited something worse. Stephen didn't just want to beat Xavier anymore. He needed to prove that the past meant nothing, that legends were just stories, that flesh and bone in the present mattered more than myths from decades ago. Thanks, Reyes. Stephen's voice was flat, distant. Dismissed. The next week, Stephen's behavior shifted. He trained with a ferocity that bordered on self-destruction. 4 hours in the gym every morning before drills, sparring sessions that left his opponents limping. His knuckles never fully healed, blood seeping through fresh wraps daily. The soldiers noticed. They whispered when he passed. He's losing it. He's been like this since the monk dropped him. I've never seen the Sarge like this. It's like he's fighting a ghost. Stephen heard none of it. His world had narrowed to one thought, repeating like a mantra with every punch, every kick, every drop of sweat. I'm stronger. I'm younger. I'm better. But late at night, when the barracks fell silent and the mountain wind howled against the windows, Stephen would stand at his window and stare toward the monastery. Lanterns glowed soft and golden in the darkness, and sometimes, if the wind shifted just right, he could see a single figure seated beneath them. Xavier, cross-legged, motionless, meditating with the same infuriating peace that had survived water, insults, and time itself. Stephen's breath came heavy, fogging the glass. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles cracking, the ache in his shoulder a constant reminder of 2 seconds. He couldn't explain. The silent dragon sat in stillness while Stephen burned with something darker than anger, hotter than pride. Envy. Envy of a peace he'd never known, of a strength he couldn't touch, of a man who'd walked away from power while Stephen had spent his entire life chasing it. The lanterns flickered. Xavier didn't move. And Stephen realized with cold certainty that this wouldn't end until one of them broke. He just had to make sure it wasn't him. The supply truck arrived every Tuesday at Oro 900 hours, rumbling up the narrow mountain road with provisions for both the base and the monastery.
Usually, two young monks came down to collect their share: rice, cooking oil, medical supplies. But this Tuesday, Xavier came alone, his bamboo staff in one hand, moving with that deliberate grace that now haunted Stephen's dreams. Stephen had been waiting. He'd positioned himself near the loading dock, ostensibly supervising the unload, but his eyes never left the monastery path. When Xavier appeared, Stephen's pulse quickened. A week of training, of bleeding knuckles and sleepless nights replaying what Reyes had told him, had led to this moment. The silent dragon, a legend, a warrior who chose to hide. Stephen stepped directly into Xavier's path as the monk approached the truck. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel lot, and several soldiers paused in their work, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Brother Xavier!" Stephen's voice was level, controlled, but his eyes burned. "Got a question for you." Xavier stopped, his expression calm, patient. "Of course, Sergeant. You used to fight." It wasn't a question. Real fights, not prayer circles and gardening. You trained at Shaolin. You fought in wars. Stephen took a step closer, close enough to smell the incense that clung to Xavier's robes. "Let's see if you still can." The soldiers who'd been unloading boxes stopped completely now. Corporal Reyes, standing near the truck's rear gate, felt his stomach drop. Private Chen whispered a quiet, "Oh no," under his breath. Xavier's eyes, warm brown, weathered by decades, didn't waver. "I am no fighter now, Sergeant Tuttle. That life ended long ago." "Convenient." Stephen's voice dripped with contempt. "You drop me in front of my men. Everyone starts whispering about how dangerous you are. But when I ask for a real demonstration, you hide behind your religion." He leaned in, his voice dropping to something sharp and cutting. "Then you're a coward." The word hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. For the first time since Stephen had met him, something flickered in Xavier's eyes. Not anger, something deeper, older, like a door being opened to a room that had been locked for years. The monk's breathing changed, just slightly. His grip on the bamboo staff tightened. "A lion need not roar to prove it is a lion," Xavier said quietly, his accent thickening. Brooklyn meeting Kingston meeting something ancient from the mountains of Henan. Words. Stephen's grin was ugly, triumphant. Just more words from a man who's forgotten what... He never finished the sentence. Stephen lunged, not mockingly this time, but with the full force of his training. A straight right aimed at Xavier's jaw, fast and brutal. The kind of punch that had ended fights in under 3 seconds his entire career. But his fist hit nothing but mountain air. Xavier had moved, not backward, but around, his body flowing like water around a stone. Stephen's momentum carried him forward, off balance for just a fraction of a second. And in that fraction, Xavier was already in motion. Stephen pivoted, threw a left hook, compensating with the muscle memory of 1,000 sparring sessions. Xavier deflected it with his forearm, the contact so light it barely registered, redirecting the force downward. Stephen felt his own power being turned against him, his body moving in ways he hadn't intended. He pressed the attack. Combination punches, a knee strike, grabbing for Xavier's robe to pull him off balance. But the monk moved like smoke, like wind, like something that existed in the spaces between Stephen's strikes rather than in front of them. Every punch landed on empty air. Every grab found nothing but fabric that slipped through his fingers. It was like fighting a ghost, and the realization sent a spike of panic through Stephen's chest that he immediately tried to bury under aggression. "Stop running!" Stephen roared, swinging wild now, faster, harder, his tactical training dissolving into raw fury. Xavier's voice came from behind him somehow, though Stephen could have sworn he'd been in front. "I am not running, Sergeant. You are chasing shadows." Stephen spun, launched a kick that should have connected with Xavier's ribs. Instead, he felt his ankle caught mid-air, his balance destroyed in an instant. The world tilted. His back hit the gravel, knocking the wind from his lungs. Before he could process what happened, Xavier was there, not on top of him, but kneeling beside him, one hand raised. 2 fingers, just 2 fingers, pressed against Stephen's throat with the lightest pressure imaginable. Stephen tried to move, tried to grab Xavier's arm, tried to do anything, but his body wouldn't respond. Those 2 fingers held him more effectively than chains, not through pain, but through perfect placement, through knowledge of anatomy so precise, it was terrifying. Xavier's face was inches from his own now. No anger there, no triumph, just that same infuriating calm, and something else, something that looked almost like sadness. "Violence," Xavier whispered, his voice barely audible over Stephen's ragged breathing, "is the language of the fearful." The fingers lifted. Xavier stood, offering his hand to help Stephen up. Stephen stared at that outstretched hand like it was a coiled snake. Around them, the soldiers stood frozen, witnesses to something they'd later struggle to describe. The fight, if it could even be called that, had lasted less than 20 seconds. Stephen ignored the offered hand and pushed himself up on his own, gravel clinging to his sweat-soaked shirt. His chest heaved, not just from exertion, but from something else. Something he'd never felt before in combat. Shame. Not the shame of losing. He'd lost sparring matches before, learned from them, improved. This was different. This was the shame of realization, of understanding, in those 20 seconds, that everything he'd built his identity on was incomplete. That strength wasn't just muscle and speed. That power wasn't just the ability to hurt. Xavier had never tried to hurt him. Not once. Not when Stephen had poured water over his head. Not during the first confrontation in the training yard. Not even now, when Stephen had attacked him with real intent. Every time, Xavier had simply showed him how far he still had to go. Showed him the difference between a fighter and a warrior, between force and control. Stephen looked at Xavier, really looked at him, and saw not an old man in orange robes, but something that transcended age, transcended the physical. He saw discipline forged over decades. He saw power that didn't need to announce itself. He saw everything Stephen had thought he wanted, embodied in a man who'd walked away from it. "Wait." Stephen's voice came out hoarse, broken. "Why not just finish it? You could have broken my arm that first time, could have hurt me just now. Why didn't you?" Xavier picked up his bamboo staff from where it had been leaning against the truck, his movements unhurried. "Because mercy finishes anger faster than fists ever could." He met Stephen's eyes, and there was no judgment there, only understanding. "You are strong, Sergeant Tuttle, but strength without wisdom is just violence waiting for permission." Xavier turned and walked toward the truck to collect his supplies, leaving Stephen standing in the gravel, surrounded by his men, feeling more exposed than he'd ever felt in his life. Corporal Reyes broke the silence first, his voice careful. "Sarge, you okay?" Stephen didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was too tight, his mind too full of the impossible equation he'd just witnessed. An old man who'd dismantled him without breaking a sweat, without anger, without even raising his voice. As Xavier disappeared up the monastery path, his orange robes bright against the gray mountain stone, Stephen touched his throat where those two fingers had been. The skin wasn't even red. There'd be no bruise, no physical evidence of what had just happened. But inside, something had cracked. Not broken, cracked. The way ice cracks before the thaw. And for the first time in his adult life, Sergeant Stephen Tuttle wasn't sure if he wanted to fight anymore. He just didn't know what else he knew how to be. The barracks felt smaller after that day. Stephen spent his evenings alone in the corner bunk, staring at the steel frame above him while his men played cards and swapped stories 10 feet away. They glanced at him occasionally, quick, nervous looks, but no one approached. The sergeant who'd ruled through dominance and volume had become a ghost in his own unit. 3 days passed, then 5. Stephen ran drills mechanically, his commands correct, but hollow. He didn't insult anyone, didn't make his usual rounds of verbal warfare that kept everyone sharp and on edge. He just existed, going through motions perfected over a decade of service, but with none of the fire that had defined him. Private Chen noticed it first. "He hasn't yelled at anyone in almost a week," he whispered to Reyes during a water break. "That's not normal." Reyes nodded slowly, watching Stephen standing alone near the fence line staring toward the monastery. "Man's going through something. Best we can do is give him space." "You think it's about the monk?" "I know it's about the monk." What Stephen's men didn't see were the nights, the hours between midnight and dawn, when sleep became impossible and the questions circled like vultures. Why didn't Xavier fight back with anger? Why did those two fingers feel stronger than any chokehold I've ever learned? How did he move like that at 69 years old? And the worst question, the one that sat in his chest like a stone. If that's what real strength looks like, what the hell have I been doing my entire life? Stephen had built his identity on being the strongest man in any room, the most aggressive, the most willing to escalate. He'd won every fight that mattered, climbed ranks through sheer physical dominance and an inability to back down. His soldiers respected him not because they liked him, but because they feared disappointing him, or worse, facing him. But Xavier had shown him something different. Power that didn't need to prove itself. Strength that chose restraint. A warrior who'd walked away from violence and somehow become more dangerous for it. The contradiction was eating Stephen alive. Meanwhile, Xavier continued his quiet work among the soldiers. Word had spread, carefully, respectfully, that the old monk knew things, medical things, mental things, spiritual things that didn't require you to be Christian or Buddhist or anything at all. Private Chen found him first, approaching the monastery garden one afternoon with a pronounced limp. Xavier looked up from his herbs, his face creasing with concern. "Your knee," Xavier said simply. "Old training injury. Acts up in the cold." Marcus tried to smile but winced instead. "The medic just gives me ibuprofen and tells me to ice it." "May I?" Xavier gestured to a flat stone near the garden. Marcus sat, and Xavier knelt beside him, his weathered hands gentle as they examined the swollen joint. "You're favoring the outside. The ligament is inflamed, yes, but the root is higher. Your hip is misaligned, creating torque." Xavier's fingers found pressure points Marcus didn't know existed. Pain flared briefly, then melted into something warm, something that felt like relief for the first time in months. "How did you—" "The body speaks if you learn to listen," Xavier said quietly. "Shaolin teaches this. Every injury tells a story of imbalance." He showed Marcus a series of stretches, gentle movements that looked more like Tai Chi than physical therapy. Do these each morning. Your body will remember its proper alignment. Marcus tried one of the stretches, feeling muscles he'd forgotten existed. This is incredible. Thank you, Brother Xavier. We are all students of our bodies, Xavier replied. I merely learned from mine longer. The next day, 2 more soldiers appeared at the garden, then 4. Then a quiet procession of men seeking help for chronic pain, anxiety, insomnia, problems the military medical system treated with pills and dismissal. Xavier never turned anyone away. He taught breathing techniques that calmed panic attacks, shared meditation practices that helped with PTSD nightmares, fixed shoulders and backs with the precision of someone who understood anatomy from both the perspective of healing and harm. And he prayed. Not pushy, not performative, just offered, quietly, for those who wanted it. Thank you, brother, became the most common phrase heard near the monastery garden. Stephen watched from a distance, his jaw tight. Part of him, the old part, the part that was dying slowly, wanted to see this as weakness. Soldiers seeking help from an outsider, from someone who'd never worn the uniform. But another part, the part cracking open like spring ice, saw something different. Saw men helping each other. Saw genuine care without the transactional nature of military hierarchy. Saw what leadership could look like when it wasn't built on fear. On the 7th day of his isolation, Stephen found himself walking toward the monastery garden at dusk. His feet carried him there before his mind could protest. Xavier was alone, watering plants with that same deliberate precision, each movement purposeful. Brother Xavier, Stephen's voice came out rougher than he intended. Xavier turned, no surprise in his expression. Sergeant Tuttle, you are welcome here. Stephen stood there, fists clenched, jaw working. Finally, why didn't you finish me? That day at the supply truck, you could have broken my arm, my neck. Hell, those 2 fingers. You could have done real damage. Xavier set down the watering can and met Stephen's eyes with that steady, infinite calm. Because mercy finishes anger faster than fists. That's not an answer. That's philosophy. Is there a difference? Xavier smiled faintly. You came here seeking to prove something, Sergeant. To yourself, to your men, perhaps to me. But I had nothing to prove. A man secure in who he is needs no victories over others. Stephen felt his throat tighten. I've won every fight I've ever been in. Have you? Xavier's question was gentle, not mocking. Or have you simply avoided the only fight that matters? Which is? The one within yourself. The words hit harder than any physical blow Xavier had delivered. Stephen looked away, toward the mountains turning gold in the fading light. And for the first time in years, he felt the sting of tears behind his eyes. I don't know how to be anything else, he whispered. Strength is all I have. No, Sergeant. Strength is all you've shown. What you have, Xavier touched his own chest, is far greater, but you've been too loud to hear it. The next morning, Stephen was summoned to Major Holland's office. The commanding officer sat behind his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, reviewing reports with obvious displeasure. Sergeant Tuttle, sit. Stephen obeyed, spine straight, eyes forward, military posture hiding inner chaos. I've been receiving reports, Holland said flatly. Your training sessions have become inconsistent. Your demeanor has changed. Several soldiers have commented on your distraction. He removed his glasses, fixing Stephen with a hard stare. "What the hell is going on with you?" "Nothing, sir. I—" "Don't bullshit me, Tuttle. You've been one of my best NCOs for 3 years. Now you're walking around like a ghost. Is this about that incident with the monk?" Stephen's jaw tightened. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted. I'm reassessing some things, sir." "Reassess on your own time. Right now I need the Sergeant Tuttle who keeps this unit sharp, not whoever this is." Holland leaned forward. "Get your head straight, Sergeant. That's not a suggestion." "Dismissed." Stephen stood, saluted, and walked out feeling like he was being torn in 2 directions. Duty demanded he return to who he was. But something deeper, something he was only beginning to understand, whispered that who he was hadn't been enough. That night, he stood at his window again, watching the monastery lanterns glow in the darkness. Xavier sat beneath them, still as stone, at peace with himself in a way Stephen had never been. And Stephen realized that the real battle, the one he'd been avoiding his entire life, was only just beginning. The live fire drill was supposed to be routine, a controlled exercise on the southeastern ridge, 12 soldiers, full gear, simulated patrol with blank rounds to test formation discipline under realistic conditions. The mountain terrain was unforgiving, but that was the point. You trained where it was hard, so combat felt manageable. Stephen led from the front, his commands sharp and precise, despite the turmoil churning beneath the surface. Major Holland's words still echoed. "Get your head straight." So he pushed harder, drove his men faster, tried to bury the questions under the familiar weight of duty. Private First Class Danny Martinez, 19 years old and fresh from basic, moved along the ridgeline behind Stephen, his rifle at low ready. The kid was eager, too eager, taking point positions he hadn't earned yet. Stephen had noticed, but said nothing. Let the kid learn through experience. That decision would haunt him. "Contact right!" someone shouted, part of the drill. Martinez pivoted fast, too fast, his boot landing on a section of ridge that looked solid but wasn't. Centuries of wind and rain had hollowed out the rock beneath a thin crust of soil and stone. The ground gave way with a sound like thunder. "Martinez!" Stephen lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab the kid's vest. His fingers caught fabric just as the ledge beneath his own feet disintegrated. Time stretched. Stephen felt the sick lurch of gravity taking over, felt Martinez's weight pulling him down, felt the world tilt sideways as both men plunged into open air. His training kicked in. Twist. Protect your head. Try to grab something. Anything. His free hand caught a cable anchored to the cliff face, part of the safety rigging they'd installed weeks ago. The impact nearly tore his shoulder from its socket, but he held on. Martinez dangled below him, held only by Stephen's grip on his vest. "I got you!" Stephen roared, though his shoulder screamed and his fingers were already starting to slip. "Don't move!" Above them, soldiers rushed to the edge. Reyes was shouting into his radio. "Man down! 2 men over the cliff! We need rope! Now!" The cable Stephen clung to groaned. Metal straining against weight it wasn't designed to hold. Below, 50 feet of empty air opened onto jagged rocks that would kill them both instantly. "Sarge, I'm slipping!" Martinez's voice cracked with terror. The kid's vest was tearing, the stitching giving way thread by thread. "Stay still!" Stephen's muscles burned. His grip was failing. The cable groaned again, and he heard the sickening pop of a bolt loosening above. Then, snap! The cable gave way. Stephen felt the world drop away again. Martinez screaming, his own voice joining in a wordless roar of defiance against gravity and death. They fell maybe 3 feet before jerking to a stop so sudden it knocked the air from Stephen's lungs. He looked up, confused, disoriented. They weren't falling, but they weren't on the cable anymore either. They were suspended by a rope, thin, brown, hand-woven, tied around both of them in a loop so perfect it seemed impossible. And at the top of the ridge, silhouetted against the sky, a flash of saffron. "Xavier?" Stephen's voice came out as a wheeze. The old monk stood at the cliff's edge, barefoot on stone, his orange robe whipping in the mountain wind. The rope was tied around his waist, the other end anchored to his bamboo staff, which he'd wedged at an angle between 2 rocks, with the precision of an engineer and the speed of a striking snake. "Do not move," Xavier called down, his voice perfectly calm. "I will bring you up." "You can't lift us both," Reyes shouted from beside him. "Brother, wait for—" But Xavier was already moving. He planted his back foot, shifted his weight with that same fluid grace Stephen had seen in the garden. In combat, in every motion the monk made, his hands gripped the rope and he began to pull. The physics should have been impossible. Xavier weighed maybe 170 soaking wet. Stephen and Martinez together were over 400 pounds of muscle, gear, and terror. But Xavier moved like he was part of the mountain itself, his body swaying with each pull, his breathing controlled, his every motion drawing on decades of training that had transformed his body into something more efficient than mere muscle. Inch by inch, they rose. Stephen could hear Xavier's breathing now, deep, measured, the same rhythm he used in meditation. The old man's arms trembled, his face tight with strain, but his movements never faltered. "Almost there," Xavier murmured. "Almost." Stephen's hand touched the ledge. He reached up, grabbing rock, pulling himself and Martinez toward solid ground. Soldiers rushed forward, grabbing them both, dragging them to safety. Martinez collapsed, sobbing with relief. Reyes was shouting medical clearance into his radio. Stephen rolled onto his back, chest heaving, and looked for Xavier. The monk was still standing at the edge, but something was wrong. His legs were shaking. His hand clutched the rope, but his grip was weakening. The staff, wedged so perfectly moments ago, was starting to shift. Stephen saw it in slow motion, Xavier's strength finally giving out after that impossible feat, the old man swaying, the staff slipping. "No!" Stephen launched himself forward, his battered body finding reserves he didn't know existed. His hand shot out and caught Xavier's wrist just as the monk began to tilt backward. For one impossible moment, their positions reversed, Stephen anchoring Xavier, pulling him back from the edge he'd just saved them from. Their eyes met, and Stephen saw surprise there. And something else. Pride. Not arrogance, but genuine, warm pride. Stephen hauled Xavier away from the cliff, both men collapsing onto safe ground. They lay there, side by side, breathing hard, staring up at the endless blue sky. Xavier turned his head slowly, a faint smile touching his lips, despite the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Even strength," he whispered, "must kneel before purpose." Stephen felt something break open in his chest, not painfully, but like a dam releasing pressure that had built for years. He'd saved Xavier, not through dominance or aggression, but through the same thing Xavier had shown him again and again, being there when it mattered, acting without thinking. choosing to save rather than prove. "Thank you," Stephen managed, his voice thick. "For all of it." Xavier's smile deepened. "You are welcome, young warrior." Around them, soldiers moved with urgent purpose, checking vitals, securing the area, calling for medical evacuation. But in that moment, Stephen and Xavier existed in a pocket of stillness, two men who'd just shown each other different kinds of strength, different ways to be powerful. Martinez sat up nearby, tears streaming down his young face. "Brother Xavier, Sergeant, you saved my life." "We saved each other," Xavier said simply, pushing himself to sitting. His hands shook, his body clearly spent, but his voice remained steady. "That is what we are meant to do." Stephen sat up too, his shoulder aching, his hands raw, his whole body feeling like it had been through a war. But his mind, for the first time in weeks, felt clear. He looked at Xavier, really looked at him, not as an obstacle or a challenge or a mystery to solve, just as a man. A good man who'd chosen mercy over mastery, who'd walked away from violence but never from courage, who'd just risked everything to save people he barely knew. "Teach me," Stephen said quietly. Xavier raised an eyebrow. "Teach you what, Sergeant?" "How to be still. How to be like you." The old monk studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That is a long path. Are you prepared to walk it?" Stephen thought about Major Holland's reprimand, about the life he'd built on aggression, about the man he'd been versus the man he was starting to glimpse he could become. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm ready to try." Xavier's smile widened, and he reached out, placing one weathered hand on Stephen's shoulder, the same shoulder he'd nearly dislocated in their first encounter. But now the touch held no threat, only understanding. "Then we begin tomorrow, at dawn, in stillness." As medical personnel arrived and the chaos of emergency response swirled around them, Stephen felt something he hadn't felt since childhood. Hope. Not for victory or dominance or proving himself stronger than everyone else. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to be a warrior. And that it started with learning to be still. Stephen showed up at the monastery garden at 05:30 the next morning, 15 minutes before dawn. Xavier was already there, seated cross-legged on a flat stone, his hands resting gently on his knees, his breathing so quiet, it seemed like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Stephen stood awkwardly at the garden's edge, still in his PT gear, unsure of the protocol. Do you interrupt meditation? Wait silently? Clear your throat? Without opening his eyes, Xavier spoke. "Sit, Sergeant. Stillness begins with simply being present." Stephen moved to a nearby stone, tried to mirror Xavier's position, and immediately felt every joint in his body protest. His knees ached. His hips were too tight. His back refused to straighten properly without tension. "This is harder than it looks," Stephen muttered. "Most worthwhile things are." Xavier's eyes opened slowly, warm with amusement. "Your body has been trained for violence and speed. Now we teach it patience and precision. They are not opposites. They are partners." For the next hour, Xavier guided Stephen through basic breathing exercises, not the tactical breathing Stephen knew from combat stress training, but something deeper. Breathing that originated from the diaphragm, that slowed the heart rate not through force, but through surrender. In, 4 counts. Hold 4 counts. Out, 6 counts, Xavier instructed. Your exhale must be longer than your inhale. This tells your body it is safe, that there is no threat requiring action. Stephen tried, failed, tried again. His mind wandered constantly, to the drill schedule, to Major Holland's reprimand, to Martinez's face as they'd fallen. Each time his attention drifted, Xavier's voice brought him back. The mind is like water, Sergeant. When turbulent, it cannot reflect clearly. But when still, Xavier gestured to a small pond in the garden where the dawn light created perfect mirror images of the sky. Clarity. Word spread quickly through the barracks. Sergeant Tuttle was spending mornings at the monastery, with the monk, meditating. The reactions varied from confusion to concern to outright mockery, though the mockery was carefully whispered, because no one wanted to be the soldier who challenged Stephen directly. "He's lost it," someone said over breakfast. "That fall scrambled his brain." "Maybe he's going through something," Marcus Chen offered quietly. "Combat stress, PTSD, happens to the best of us." Corporal Reyes said nothing, but he watched Stephen during drills with sharp eyes. The sergeant was different. That much was obvious. But different how? Weaker? Or something else? During hand-to-hand training that week, Stephen paired with a cocky private who had been angling for a humiliation match for months. The kid came in aggressive, all swagger and speed, throwing combinations meant to overwhelm. Stephen moved differently than before, less forceful, more fluid. He redirected rather than blocked, guided rather than countered. Within seconds, the private was on the ground, not hurt, not humiliated, just gently controlled and released. "Again," Stephen said. They went 5 rounds. Each time, the same result. The private grew increasingly frustrated, while Stephen remained calm, almost serene. When the session ended, Stephen helped the kid up and said something no one expected. "You're strong and fast, but you're fighting yourself as much as me. Center your breathing first. The body follows the breath." It sounded like something Xavier would say. The private blinked, nodded slowly, and walked away looking less angry and more thoughtful. Reyes caught Stephen afterward. "Sarge, that was different." "Yeah." Stephen wiped sweat from his face. "I'm learning there's more than one way to win." "The monastery?" Stephen nodded. "Every morning. Xavier's teaching me. I don't even know what to call it. Not just fighting. Living, maybe." "And Major Holland?" Stephen's jaw tightened. "I'm still doing my job, just doing it better." The morning sessions expanded. Breathing became meditation. Meditation became movement. Basic Shaolin forms that looked like slow-motion combat, but felt like poetry. Xavier demonstrated each position with the patience of someone who'd spent decades perfecting them. Horse stance. Lower. Your thighs should burn. This builds the root, the foundation. A tree without roots falls in the first wind. Stephen's legs trembled after 30 seconds. Xavier held the position for 5 minutes without shaking. Crane stance, balance on one leg. This teaches you that stability comes from center, not from width. A balanced man cannot be toppled. Stephen wobbled, caught himself, wobbled again. Xavier stood perfectly still, his raised leg at a 90-degree angle, his breathing unchanged. Each failure taught Stephen something. Each moment of frustration showed him how much noise lived inside his own head, how little control he actually had over his own body, despite years of training. "You are fighting the form," Xavier observed. "You try to force your body into position. Instead, invite your body to flow into it. Ask, don't command." It sounded like nonsense, but when Stephen softened his approach, breathed deeper, stopped trying to muscle his way through the movements,
Something clicked. His body began to understand what his mind was still learning.
Strength wasn't just force. It was also yielding. Power wasn't just aggression. It was also patience. Xavier introduced him to the monastery's meal practices. The monks ate in silence, each bite deliberate, each flavor fully experienced. No phones, no conversation, no distraction. Stephen sat with a simple bowl of rice, vegetables, and tea. The first meal took him 45 minutes. He'd never eaten so slowly in his life. Taste each grain, Xavier had instructed. Feel the texture. Honor the hands that grew it, prepared it, offered it. Eating is not fuel delivery. It is participation in life. Stephen chewed slowly, tasting things he'd never noticed before despite eating rice 1,000 times. The slight sweetness, the way texture changed as he chewed, the satisfaction that came not from fullness, but from presence. His mind screamed that this was a waste of time, but something deeper, something quiet and rarely heard, whispered that this was the point, slowing down enough to actually experience living. 2 weeks into the training, Stephen sat in meditation as dawn broke over the mountains. Xavier was beside him, equally still. For the first time, Stephen's mind didn't wander. The breathing came naturally. The stillness felt not like restraint, but like peace. He opened his eyes to find Xavier watching him with that gentle smile. "You felt it," Xavier said, not a question. Yeah. For a moment there, everything just stopped. The noise stopped." Xavier nodded. "That is the beginning. The world is loud, Sergeant Tuttle. It will always be loud. Wars, duties, demands. They never quiet themselves." He touched his chest. "But you can create silence here. And from that silence, clarity. From clarity, right action." "Is that what you did? When you left Shaolin?" Xavier's expression grew distant. "I learned to fight with skill, but I did not learn to fight with wisdom. That distinction nearly destroyed me and the man I hurt. So I walked away, found another path, and learned the hardest lesson of all, which is, you cannot silence the world until you silence yourself." The words settled over Stephen like snow, each one soft, but accumulating into something that changed the landscape entirely. He thought about the years of shouting, of dominating, of proving himself loudest and strongest and most aggressive. All that noise. And for what? Respect, born from fear, loyalty built on intimidation, a version of strength that left him feeling empty even when he won? "I've been so loud," Stephen said quietly. "Yes, but now you are learning to listen." Xavier stood, offering his hand. "Come, there is much more to learn, and you have barely begun." That afternoon, during routine drills, several soldiers noticed the change. Stephen's commands were clearer, but quieter. His corrections were firm, but not cruel. When Private Martinez, cleared for duty after the cliff incident, fumbled a rifle check, Stephen didn't scream or humiliate. He simply walked over, guided the kid's hands to the proper position, and said, "Breathe first. Center yourself. The weapon responds to calm hands." Martinez did as instructed, completed the check perfectly, and looked at Stephen with something new in his eyes. Not fear. Respect. Real respect. Corporal Reyes watched from a distance and turned to Marcus Chen. "He hasn't lost his edge. He's sharper than ever, just different sharp. Like a scalpel instead of a hammer," Marcus agreed. "Exactly." That night, Stephen returned to the barracks to find his men less tense around him. Conversations didn't stop when he entered. No one avoided eye contact. The atmosphere had shifted from controlled fear to something closer to camaraderie. Stephen lay on his bunk, hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in his military career, he felt not like a weapon being deployed, but like a human being learning to live. And, in the darkness, with the mountain wind whistling outside, he smiled. The orders came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the bureaucratic efficiency that governed all military movements. Unit relocation in 72 hours. New assignment, different mountain range, different mission. Pack light, move fast, leave nothing behind. Stephen read the memo twice, and for the first time in his career, relocation felt less like adventure and more like loss. He had 6 more dawns with Xavier, 6 more chances to learn, 6 more mornings of stillness before returning to a world that demanded noise. The final 3 days passed in a strange blur. Stephen maintained his duties, oversaw packing, conducted final equipment checks, ensured every soldier was ready for transport. But his mornings remained sacred. 05:30 at the monastery garden, rain or shine, he sat beside Xavier and practiced the silence he was only beginning to understand. "You will take this with you," Xavier said on their last full morning together. "The stillness doesn't live here in these mountains, it lives here." He touched Stephen's chest. "Geography changes. Your center does not, unless you let it." "What if I forget? What if I go back to being—" Stephen struggled for words. "What I was before?" Xavier's eyes held that infinite patience Stephen had once mistaken for weakness. "You will forget sometimes. The world is designed to make you forget. But each time you remember, each time you pause, breathe, return to center, the path becomes clearer. Awakening is not a single moment, Sergeant. It is a lifetime of choosing presence over noise." Stephen nodded, committing the words to memory like coordinates on a map he'd need to navigate in the dark. "Will you stay here?" Stephen asked. "At the monastery?" "For now, until my path leads elsewhere." Xavier smiled. "The mountain teaches until the student is ready for the valley. Then new teachers appear. I'm going to miss this. Miss you. And you." Xavier placed his weathered hand on Stephen's shoulder, that gesture of understanding that had replaced their first violent encounter. "But gratitude doesn't require proximity. You carry what you've learned. That is enough." The night before departure, Stephen sat at the small desk in his quarters, a single lamp casting yellow light across paper he'd requisitioned from the supply office. He'd never been good with words. His whole life had been actions, orders, physical presence. But some things needed to be said in a way that would last. He wrote carefully, crossing out lines, starting over, until the words felt true. "To the man I called weak. You showed me what real power is. Not the kind that dominates or demands. The kind that remains steady when everything else breaks. The kind that chooses mercy when vengeance would be easier. You broke me, but you broke me the right way. Like breaking stone to reveal what's underneath. I don't know if I'll ever master what you've taught me. Most days, I'll probably fail, but I'll keep trying. Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving, even when I couldn't see it myself." Stephen Tuttle. He folded the paper carefully, creasing each edge with the precision Xavier had taught him in everything. Small actions done with full attention. Nothing wasted, nothing careless. Dawn came cold and clear on their final day. The transport trucks idled in formation, exhaust clouding the mountain air. Soldiers loaded gear with practiced efficiency, their voices subdued, some sad to leave, others eager for the next assignment, most simply focused on the tasks at hand. Stephen stood apart from the organized chaos, his rucksack already loaded, his uniform pressed sharp. He looked toward the monastery path, then made his decision. "Reyes," he called, "you're in charge of final check. I'll be back in 20. "Where are you going, Sarge?" "To say goodbye." No one questioned him. They'd learned that the sergeant who returned from morning sessions at the monastery was someone worth following, not just obeying. Stephen climbed the stone steps to the monastery as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting everything gold and amber. His breath misted in the cold air, his footsteps quiet against stone worn smooth by centuries of monks making this same journey. Xavier sat in his customary spot, cross-legged on the flat stone overlooking the valley, his orange robes bright against the gray mountain backdrop. His eyes were closed, his hands resting gently on his knees. His breathing so controlled it seemed like he might be carved from the same stone he sat upon. Stephen approached slowly, not wanting to disturb the meditation, but knowing he had little time. He knelt on the cold stone in front of Xavier, the position no longer awkward or uncomfortable. His body had learned what his mind once resisted. He placed the folded note on the ground between them, then pressed his palms together in the gesture Xavier had taught him, the mudra of respect and gratitude. For a long moment, neither man moved. The mountain wind carried the scent of incense from the temple, mixing with the clean sharpness of high-altitude air. Prayer flags snapped and fluttered somewhere nearby. A bird called out, clear and solitary. Then Xavier's eyes opened slowly. That same dark warmth that had witnessed Stephen's transformation from aggressor to student. He looked down at the note, then back up at Stephen, and smiled. That same faint, knowing smile that had infuriated Stephen when they first met. But now, it felt different. Now Stephen understood it wasn't condescension or mockery. It was recognition. The smile of someone who'd walked a difficult path and was honored to guide another along it. Xavier picked up the note, unfolded it with care, and read. His expression didn't change, but something deepened in his eyes, something that might have been pride, or joy, or the quiet satisfaction of a teacher watching a student finally understand. "The greatest victory," Xavier said softly, his voice carrying despite its quietness, "is not over another man. It is over the self. You have begun that journey." Stephen Tuttle, that is no small thing. I couldn't have started without you. You carried the seed. I only helped you water it. Xavier refolded the note and slipped it into his robe over his heart. I will keep this. And when my faith wavers, when I wonder if my path has purpose, I will read it and remember that every encounter is a chance to plant light. Stephen felt his throat tighten. He wasn't a man prone to tears, but the edges of his eyes burned. Will I see you again? If the path wills it. But remember, I am not the source of your stillness, you are. I simply showed you where it lived. Xavier stood slowly, his movements still graceful despite his age, and offered his hand. Stephen took it, rose, and for a moment they stood facing each other, the sergeant and the monk, the student and the teacher. Two warriors who'd found each other at exactly the right moment. The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of truck engines and shouted orders. Time was running short. Go. Xavier said gently. Your men need you. But carry this. He touched Stephen's chest again. And you will never be lost. Stephen bowed deeply, holding it longer than necessary, imprinting this moment into memory. When he straightened, Xavier had already returned to his meditation posture, eyes closed, hands resting, perfectly still. As Stephen descended the monastery steps for the last time, Xavier's voice drifted down, barely louder than the wind, but perfectly clear. He who conquers himself is the greatest warrior of all. An old Shaolin mantra, one that Stephen now understood wasn't about combat or victory. It was about the hardest battle anyone ever fought, the one against your own nature, your own pride, your own worst instincts. Stephen paused halfway down the steps and looked back. Xavier sat framed by the rising sun, his silhouette eternal and still against the golden light. He looked less like a man, and more like a principle made flesh, peace holding its ground against chaos, stillness refusing to be moved by the storm. Stephen burned the image into his mind, then continued down to where his unit waited. The convoy rolled out at 800 hours sharp, a line of trucks grinding down the mountain road in practiced formation. Stephen sat in the lead vehicle, watching the monastery shrink in the side mirror until it was just a small collection of buildings clinging to the mountainside. "You okay, Sarge?" Martinez asked from the driver's seat. "Yeah." Stephen kept his eyes on the mirror. "Better than okay." As the convoy rounded a bend and the monastery disappeared from view entirely, Stephen closed his eyes and did what Xavier had taught him. He breathed, deep, controlled, centered, found the stillness that lived not in any place, but in the space between heartbeats. The truck bounced over rough terrain. Soldiers joked and complained and slept in the back. The radio crackled with logistics and coordinates. The world continued its noise. But inside, Stephen carried something the world couldn't touch. A seed planted, taking root, beginning to grow. And somewhere behind them, on a mountain that had witnessed countless soldiers come and go, an old monk in orange robes sat in eternal meditation, smiling faintly as the wind carried away the sound of engines. The circle was complete. But the journey, the real journey, was only beginning. In a world of noise and pride, sometimes it takes the quietest man alive to teach us what strength really means.